I thought today I'm supposed to talk on the power of the mind, but I think when I talk about that, I want to say something about many people's ideas about we can call them the planes of nature, the astral, mental, etc., the usual, what people talk about it. I personally think in this modern day, I call them the levels of consciousness. I think the levels of consciousness is a far better word than plane of body, because I think it has to do with our levels of consciousness. And also, when we talk about any of it, I think we should think of these levels of consciousness from the physical body, which is, after all, a representation of what I think is a very basic theosophical concept that each one of us has within him. Now, I'm going to use, can I use my new language, which I've invented for talking to non-theosophists, which I really do, more than talking to members of the Theosophical Society. We've got all these grades of talking about the ego, all these things. I call it the inner self in different stages. And I think that each one of us has this fundamental part within ourselves, which is always peaceful, quiet, and has a wisdom. I do not think that we reach that state all the time, but I think it comes to us with birth. And I think when we talk about the mental level, it isn't here is the physical, here is the etheric, the mental, etc., etc. They are all influencing one another. It isn't all separate levels of consciousness, but levels which, after all, are constantly working together. After all, the theosophical point of view is, can I continue to call it the inner self? All right with you? Is the basic part of us, and we express ourselves. When we express ourselves in our feelings, it's really scientifically proved that our feelings affect our physical body. I mean, I think that's a scientific fact. But I think the emotions, which of course, and our feelings, which dominate us to a great extent, are again, as we know from our experience, altered by our thinking. The thinking and feeling and the different levels, could I call it thinking? Okay, and mind. There are different levels, but there are different levels. Could I call them levels of consciousness? But could I also call them levels of experience? Would that make sense to you? We have to think about this way as experiences which each one of us has through life. Now, I'm talking about the mind. I think before we often think of it as a purely intellectual capacity. But all of us have experienced a sudden burst of, let's say, emotion. But when we even express it and feel it, we think about it, and we realize that this is not the right way of thinking about it. And when you begin to think, am I making that clear? At that moment, your mental energies also mix up with your emotional energies. Does that make sense, what I'm saying? And thus, I think our mental capacities in our daily life have a much greater influence upon us than we realize. As you may know, my experience has been for many years with people who are sick with all sorts of diseases, and we deal with it in many ways that I'm not going to talk about. But having seen some of the very painful things, I think that's not the way we experiences from children up, which people are experiencing today. Let me explain something. When somebody has a very painful experience in childhood, part of that is an emotional experience, but part of it becomes a symbol in what we might call the mental part of us, or the mental part of it. Does that make sense? If you want to ask a question, I do not care if you interrupt, and you're going to have plenty of time to ask questions. Thus, through life, we really form in our emotional part of us and our mental part a pathway of thinking and building a pattern in our mental field and our emotional field, that you may be only a symbol. But when a person has a similar experience, they very often automatically fall in that pattern, instead of being able, like we Theosophists, I hope, think of being quiet and realize that we wish to break the pattern. It's a very difficult thing to do. But a lot of people are conditioned that way. So thus, our emotional and the mental part of it, which is the memory and the thinking, affect our lives a great deal. Now, what is the strength? First of all, I think for us members of the Theosophical Society, and to me, all my life, I was brought up in Theosophist, I must say. I've been probably a longer member of the society than anyone here, because I've been so young a member. It is this basic assumption that we have, and that part of us is this inner self in which we can have quiet. And as I say, I've had an extraordinary, crazy upbringing, but my mother got me to meditate at the age of 5. And thus, that idea of being quiet and thinking of it has affected me all my life. But I think in our very turbulent and stressful times, I think if we can think, I teach hundreds of nurses, hundreds of people, but it is effective. It is the thinking, not only the thinking or the experiencing with the emotions, but we also have part of that which studies and tries through our meditation and all these things to understand something about, you might say, this other part of ourselves. And I think the flashes of intuition, which everybody gets, are flashes from a different level through the mental, and we get it instantly and get the sudden insight of what is right. I think everybody has had flashes of intuition. And I think it comes from that level of consciousness. I think the mind has a powerful effect upon us. I deal, of course, with people who have had a very tough time in life. And I have found one of the most helpful things is to have a person in their mind visualize. Visualization and that is a fact and a work of the mental level, is a very valuable asset when we are conscious of our difficulties, you might say about our difficult habits, because if one is aware of it, this is my suggestion, if we become aware of it, now let me say this, for myself, I have a symbol. The one thing I love dearly is trees. That's my personal symbol. A tree stands for me as a symbol of strength. It's affected all the time by weather. It follows its innate pattern of what a tree should be. And to me, it always has been a symbol of strength and beauty. Thus, if I'm aware of it, and this is what I tell a lot of people, of something which I have experienced, which is not pleasant, to become aware of it, to say you've done something, I think, it makes one ashamed and one does it again. But if one visualizes, now I'm talking about the tree, you can pick any symbol in the world you like, but I have to talk in terms of my own experience, isn't that true? If one thinks, and here comes the mind, the visualization of a tree makes an effort, doesn't it? It's using an energy. It is not just thinking vaguely, it's a concrete use of the energy. And the focusing of the mind on a tree as a symbol, let's say, of peace, makes, and at the time when one is disturbed or not behaving properly, makes one realize mentally, and it brings in this other energy which affects our feelings. Is that clear what I've said? If you don't, hold up your hand. And I think this is a much more effective way than all the time saying, I'm sorry I've done this, and not have the, or whatever habit you've got. But I think it makes one aware also, and I have many, many ways of visualizations which I deal with people, to get rid. You have many people suffer from something which I call the resentment. They are angry because of their past experiences. And I think resentment, if one carries it out, even if one is completely unaware of that resentment, is a block to really spiritual understanding, because you are not aware of what you are feeling yourself. And of course, in today's society, that is very common to pick up. And I think if one gives a person, I'm not going to go in all the details, of a mental concept, what they can do every day, a visualization, it is quite possible to get over this resentment. Because when one makes a mental picture and has the desire to change, this is the important thing, of course, that one really has the desire to change. Let me say this. If one has the desire to change, I think I said that there are all these feelings in a higher mental level of unity, of really understanding, but it also is a gateway to a level of where one is conscious of the unity of all things in the universe. And that's part of the consciousness of the inner self. Does that make sense again? Yes? Thus, I think if one can use the mental field, or the mental part of ourselves, and realize that we have this ability to have pictures that they help us really much more clearly than just feeling it only. We often feel something over and over again and just feel it for 20 years. Don't you think that is true? Well, if we bring this other element of understanding and the visualization, as I say, I deal with people who go through terrible circumstances. It has been helpful. And another thing, we talk a lot about it, but we take our emotions. I don't think that many people realize that when they feel anger, love, love versus anger, that one is projecting an energy not only to the person one feels it to, but you're projecting that in the atmosphere. I don't think that we realize it. I think you believe what I say, but I don't think you realize the strength of it. I deal with a lot of child abuse myself, and it isn't only, technically it's only physical, but I think what parents and child abuse is only part of me, who consistently say their child is no good. I was going to swear, but I wasn't. I didn't. Have also, what they don't realize is, there are two, I'm not going to talk about that too much, that some children are very sensitive. And an emotional feeling of dislike, whatever you like to call, they get that energy. And some people can reject it, they are different temperaments, but some children take it in, am I making it, and cannot reject it. And it therefore can affect them for quite a bit in their life. And I think the members of the society even aren't aware of the power of this projection of our feelings. But I don't think that they realize also that in a different degree, what we think of a person, and for instance, in many meditation groups, they're sending out thoughts of peace, aren't they? Whatever it is, however you do, if you really think and feel that you cannot, let me say this, can I tell you what I have taught my nurses? That before they can even do this technique, they first of all, remember, not very few of them are members of the society, but they do practice this, that when we feel something, I use my hands. We take in and relate to one another by taking in one another's feelings. Would you agree with that? So what I teach my nurses is, if they want to project this, they do not have to take in, but they should withdraw their consciousness within their heart, that we call centering, and feel first at peace, and then project the feeling of peace and whatever the healing energy is towards the patient. Am I making that clear? Therefore, you can't do this. Doing this does nothing. Am I making that clear? It's no use only being the instrument of your feelings. When you come to talking about healing, you have to be at peace. Otherwise, you will not project it. Does that make sense? And I think thinking like this has really changed in the 18 years since we started it. many of the nurses have changed very, very fundamentally. And they have embraced theosophical ideas in their life, and that is the most important thing. Now, I think I've talked about the mental part of us being between our emotions and also almost between the spiritual natures, or whether you call it the Buddhic, whatever you call it, let's make it simpler. Isn't that true? That part of ourself, which is closer to the inner self. And the understanding, I think, is important. In the theosophical literature, now can I say something not nice? I think we use a lot of terms, but I don't think that the terms are clear enough to affect our lives. I mean, this one fact, which is obvious, that by what we feel, it's not what we say only, it is what we feel. We are projecting an energy towards a group, projecting an energy towards a person. But also, in a subtle way, what we think. If you see a person, for instance, come in and say, he's not very nice, you're also projecting both an emotional and a mental energy. Does that make sense? So you have a right to say somebody isn't pleasant. But I think if you could beware and just say it, this doesn't seem such a pleasant, but not have this sense of rejection. Does that make sense? I really believe that members do not understand their powers, what the powers of thought and feeling are, and how they can affect our lives. And the mental part, the thinking clearly, is an important part. Let me say this, I'm a very tough girl to my nurses. Because so many people are good-hearted, and what they want to do is almost hug a person physically and send a hugging emotion. Does that make sense? I say that's not their business. Their business is, first of all, to center. It's not clear. And when we approach a patient, it is peace they need. And it's a sense of peace to reduce their anxiety, etc., before you can really, they can accept any healing. Does that make sense? The disciplining of oneself away from wanting to hug people who do not appreciate it. I mean, if they are very sick. I mean, I'm talking about the very sick ones. I'm not talking about everyone here. I think all this requires a discipline. But I think it changes one's life if one can feel and think. I think one should realize and study how our thinking, how our mind affect us. I think it's fun to think. You don't think so? I mean, to discuss even very difficult metaphysical questions, to discuss it, not only to accept it, is stretching the mind. There's that other part of our mind which we don't use so much. It's not the emotional part, but really enlarging the scope of the energy of our own mind. The mind plays a very powerful and has a powerful effect on how we behave, how we remember, and also the mind controls the emotions to some extent. If we make up our mind that we are going to change and that we are going to be a person who doesn't take in, but who gives. Does that make sense?
Following her talk, Dora responded to questions from the audience. The first question came from a person wishing to know how one can work through anger and resentment.
I suppose anger is, you can feel it for the moment, but I suppose in my language, resentment is when you can maybe have an undercurrent towards that memory, and you really have an undercurrent of distinct dislike when you think of a person. Does that mean anything? You may irritate me, and I get angry. Isn't that true? Or you can say, but the anger, the resentment in my language is something you carry through for years and years. When you think of a person or an event, it may have hurt you. You know what, the people who have suffered this when they were children often have built a pattern within them, and they don't realize that they're 40 years old now, and that they are grown up, in other words, and yet they are following a pattern which was begun very early in life. Does that make sense? If you can remember, in other words, the event which has made you feel that resentment, shall I use the word resentment? Then I think if you, first of all, you want me to say what I say to the people in regard to resentment? Do you want me to do that?
Sure.
I think if you feel that resentment, what I'm suggesting to people is, first of all, to say, if it happened when you were a child, I'm grown up. I'm a different person. Then center, as much as we can talk, I say, put your consciousness and feel that also you have, each one of us has that ability to feel quiet and peaceful. To project the image of the person they have that resentment. Make a picture. And instead of feeling love, feel goodwill to that person, whatever they are doing. But thinking of that person in the distance helps to break the pattern. Does that make sense, what I'm saying? You're breaking the idea that it affects it. And it really does work, but it takes a determination to do it. Yes.
How does one prevent anger from turning into resentment?
Well, I think if it's different from a cause and a person, because in a person, it's very personal, and it's something between two people. In a cause, we are living in a world where there's a tremendous lot of misery, and the causes are fairly well known. It is no use feeling anger. Try to substitute for that what you can do positively to help in any way for a world or something situation. Isn't that so? When it is with regard to a person, I think the difficulty is that we have a memory of a lot of resentment, interchange of feelings. Could we put it that way? I think the centering is really one of the basic things, is to center. And if one is centered, and is therefore, if you can center, you have self-confidence. Does that make sense?
Yes.
If you are not centered, many people have no self-confidence or very little. You can think of that person because you're strong, and when you want to get anger, think, if you like, project deliberately and send the color of peace. I'm not just saying anything. If it helped to visualize, send a yellow force towards them. See it? You are reacting positively, and you are not taking in. Does that make sense?
Very much so.
And as a matter of fact, if you do that, it affects the other person. Because if they don't have this interchange, it affects it. Any other question?
How does one teach a young child to meditate?
Now that's a tough thing, because I was brought up very differently from most people. I think if you could sit with a child, just let us sit peacefully and quietly for 3 minutes or 4 minutes. And sit quietly and say, let us both be happy and love one another, or something like that. See what I mean? If a child is young, I was brought up in a very peculiar fashion. So that's easier, but in every household, it is that. And if you get angry with the child, then if you could, after that, if you have had it for a few minutes, let us sit together and meditate for a few minutes. Does that make sense? Or use any other word you like. Would that be possible? I think that would be helpful, I think. Just to be quiet and send out, say both of you, send out loving thoughts to one another. Would that be a way of doing it? Any other question?
You said that the terms we use are not clear enough to make a difference in our lives. Can you give us some examples of what you mean?
Well, I tell you, we have a lot of Sanskrit words. I'm not against the Sanskrit language. Of course, it's the most wonderful language in the world. But we are in the United States. And sometimes, even if you use the word Atman, what does it mean to most people? I mean, I was brought up on Buddhism when I was, and Hinduism, as I was a member of, as I was brought up as a Theosophist very early. And I got quite used to it. But a lot of words don't mean much to another. If he could say what it is, and say this is a word used all over the world, but the meaning is something else in ordinary American literature. Would you? I don't know why I picked on that. Does that make sense? Or would you not agree with me? I mean, there are many, many words like that. And I think it would have a better meaning to us in, as you say, now I'm using the inner self, which has no meaning. But but also Atman, the ego, all this, there are psychological terms in it, doesn't mean to my audience who are not Theosophists. Does that make sense? I have to use words which will affect and have meaning to my audience of non-Theosophists. Isn't that true? So I'm always searching. But just think about it. What does a word mean? If you're talking in a public audience, if you're, after all, used to talking to Theosophists, that's fine, isn't that so? They know the meaning of words. But if you want to attract the public and bring them in my healing work, they're not Theosophists. All right, thank you very much.